Case 1. Amber Waterman. October 31st, 2022. Western District of Missouri, McDonald County. There are crimes that test the limits of what the human mind can fully process. There are cases that arrive in a courtroom, are laid out in front of a judge, and still manage to leave everyone in the room searching for words adequate enough to respond. The case of Amber Waterman is one of those cases. A federal judge, a man who had presided over countless serious criminal matters, stood at the bench after hearing all the evidence and told the courtroom that he could not impose a sentence sufficient for what had been done. He said the crime before him represented, in his view, a new level entirely, something that the sentencing guidelines had not been built to fully address, because cases like this one almost never happen. Almost never. Amber Dawn Waterman was 44 years old and lived with her husband Jamie Waterman in Pineville, Missouri, a small, quiet community tucked into the Ozark Hills of McDonald County, just a few miles north of the Arkansas state line. By outward appearances, there was nothing remarkable about her life. She was a middle-aged woman in a rural town. She had a home. She had a husband. She had a daily routine. But beginning sometime around the 25th of October, 2022, Amber Waterman set into motion a plan that was not impulsive, not accidental, and not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. It was deliberate. It was calculated. And it required an innocent young woman to die. That young woman was Ashley Bush. Ashley was 33 years old and lived in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, just across the Missouri border. She was approximately 31 weeks pregnant with a daughter she had already named Valkyrie Grace Willis. Ashley had a fiancé named Josh Willis who loved her. She had a family that was preparing to welcome a new life. She had every reason in the world to feel hopeful about the weeks ahead. She was the kind of person whose presence lit up the people around her, warm, trusting, and completely without suspicion that a stranger she had recently met at a public library had constructed an elaborate false identity for the sole purpose of targeting her. That stranger was Amber Waterman, operating under the name Lucy Barrows. Court records filed in the Western District of Missouri confirm that Waterman created a fraudulent Facebook account under that false name on or around October 25, 2022. The account was not carelessly thrown together. It was built to appear credible, the kind of profile that would not raise immediate alarm to a young woman who was simply looking for opportunity and connection. Using this identity, Waterman made contact with Ashley online, and the two women began communicating. Waterman presented herself as someone with employment connections, a person who could help Ashley secure a job through a company in Bentonville, Arkansas. She expressed genuine warmth. She offered real promise. She even made arrangements to meet Ashley in person so that the relationship would feel more grounded and legitimate. That first in-person meeting took place on October 28, 2022, at the Gravette Public Library in Arkansas. To anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like two women talking, building a connection. Ashley's fiancé Josh later told investigators that Ashley had been in contact with this woman named Lucy, and that Lucy had been offering to help her find work. The meeting at the library had gone well, he said. Ashley trusted her. 3 days later, on the morning of October 31, 2022, Halloween, Ashley Bush climbed into a pickup truck driven by Amber Waterman at the Handy Stop convenience store in Maysville, Arkansas. She believed she was being taken to meet a supervisor in Bentonville for a job interview. Josh Willis was actually present at that moment. According to his statement to investigators, he saw Ashley in the passenger seat of the vehicle. He made eye contact with the woman driving. The truck pulled away. That was the last time Josh Willis saw Ashley Bush alive. What happened next unfolded entirely out of public view, across the state line, inside the Waterman property in Pineville, Missouri. Federal prosecutors laid out the timeline in painstaking detail during court proceedings. Rather than driving to any job interview, Waterman took Ashley directly to her own home. At some point during the hours that followed, Ashley Bush suffered what an autopsy would later describe as penetrating trauma to the torso, injuries so severe that she did not survive. Her unborn daughter, Valkyrie Grace Willis, also did not survive. At approximately 5 o'clock that same evening, emergency responders in Pineville received a call regarding an infant who was not breathing. Waterman had gone to a nearby store and presented herself as a woman who had just given birth in her pickup truck on the way to the hospital. Responders rushed to the scene. The infant could not be saved. Waterman's story, that she had delivered the baby herself, began to unravel almost immediately. Authorities noted inconsistencies. They noted that there was no evidence she had been pregnant. They began asking harder questions. When investigators visited the Waterman home on November 1, 2022, Amber initially told them she had suffered a miscarriage. She then changed her account. Her husband Jamie was present. Detectives noticed what appeared to be bloodstains inside the cab of a pickup truck matching the description given by Josh Willis. The vehicle was seized. A search warrant was obtained for both the truck and the property. When authorities questioned Jamie Waterman again on November 3, 2022, his story changed. According to the affidavit filed by the FBI and McDonald County investigators, Jamie told detectives that after their initial interview, Amber had privately admitted to him what she had done. She had led him to Ashley's body, which was lying face down near a boat behind the home, wrapped in a blue tarp. Jamie Waterman, according to court records, then helped his wife move Ashley's remains to a fire pit behind the property, where they were burned. The charred remains were then moved again, placed in the bed of Jamie's pickup truck and relocated to a different site. Ashley Bush had been reported as a missing person on October 31. 3 days later, investigators had enough to act. Both Amber and Jamie Waterman were arrested and charged federally. Amber faced one count of kidnapping resulting in death. She was later indicted on an additional count, causing the death of a child in utero, for the loss of Valkyrie Grace Willis, who was 31 weeks developed and would have been born within weeks. The charges together carried mandatory life sentences under federal statute. On July 30, 2024, Amber Waterman appeared in federal court in Springfield, Missouri, and entered guilty pleas to both counts. She did not do so as part of any plea agreement. She offered no deal. She simply admitted, on the record, in open court, that every detail the prosecutor laid out was accurate. She had targeted Ashley Bush. She had lured her under false pretenses. She had taken her life and the life of her unborn child. She had attempted to present that child as her own. On October 15, 2024, United States District Court sentenced Amber Waterman to 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison without the possibility of parole. She was also ordered to pay $105,000 in restitution. The judge addressed the courtroom and said he could not impose a sentence sufficient for what Waterman had done, that the crime existed at a level he struggled to adequately respond to within the guidelines available to him. Members of Ashley's family spoke at the sentencing. One relative said she prayed that suffering would return to Waterman tenfold. Another called her the face of evil and said she carried a black soul. The words came from a place of unimaginable loss. A family who had lost a daughter, a sister, a fiancé, and a granddaughter who never had the chance to take a single breath. Ashley Bush was 33 years old. She had a name picked out for her daughter. She had a future. She had a man who loved her. She had people who are still grieving her today. Amber Waterman will spend the rest of her natural life in a federal prison cell. Jamie Waterman later pleaded guilty to 1 count of being an accessory after the fact to kidnapping resulting in death. He faced up to 15 years. The case of Amber Waterman stands as a reminder that danger does not always announce itself. It does not always look the way we expect. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, offers a helpful hand, and sends a message on social media with the promise of something better. The justice system, in this case, responded with the full weight of the law, and the name Ashley Bush and the name Valkyrie Grace Willis will not be forgotten. If you or someone you know has concerns about a missing person or suspicious contact, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children can be reached at 1-800-THE-LOST. Do not hesitate to report what you see. Ashley Bush's fiancé made that call. It is the reason there was justice at all. If you found this case as powerful as we did, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every like and every subscriber helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Case 2, Ashley Parmeley. May 28, 2024. Jefferson County Circuit Court, St. Francois County Circuit Court. There are cases in the true crime space that arrive without warning and stop communities in their tracks. Cases where the facts, once known, feel so heavy that ordinary people find themselves searching for some framework, some explanation, that makes what happened even remotely comprehensible. The case of Ashley Parmeley stopped the community of Festus, Missouri, in exactly that way on a Tuesday morning in late May of 2024. It stopped the Festus Elementary School, which had to call in grief counselors for children who had lost a classmate. It stopped a neighborhood Little League field, where a softball team called the Pink Flamingos held a balloon release at the start of their scheduled game because their teammate was gone. It stopped the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, whose spokesperson stood in front of cameras and asked the community simply to pray, not just for the victims, but for the first responders who had been dispatched that morning and would carry what they saw for the rest of their lives. Ashley Parmeley was 36 years old and lived in Parmeley, a community in Jefferson County, Missouri, just south of St. Louis. She was the mother of 2 children, 9-year-old Scarlett Parmeley Daerty, who was described by her teachers as bubbly, energetic, trustworthy, and full of heart, and 2-year-old Isaac Baum, who, according to those who knew him, adored his big sister completely. The 2 children had different fathers, but by all accounts from neighbors and friends, they were a unit. Siblings who genuinely loved each other. Children who were known in the neighborhood and spoken of warmly. In the days leading up to May 28, 2024, there were signs that something was very wrong with Ashley Parmeley, signs that those around her, through no fault of their own, did not fully recognize as a mental health crisis in progress. She changed her social media profile photo to a black screen. She had posted in the past about her struggles with depression and about feeling that her children might be better off without her as their primary caregiver. In the hours before the events of that Tuesday morning, she appears to have descended into a severe psychotic state, one that would later be examined by multiple independent psychiatric professionals and determined to have rendered her, at the time, unable to comprehend the nature or wrongfulness of her actions. That determination would shape everything that followed in the courtroom. But on the morning of May 28, 2024, none of that had yet been established. What investigators knew was this. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Ashley Parmeley drove her vehicle to the parking lot of the Festus Police Department. She walked into the lobby. She was wet. She was disheveled. She told the officers at the front that she had killed her children. Officers moved immediately. Inside Parmeley's vehicle, parked just outside the police station, they found 9-year-old Scarlett in the trunk. Scarlett had suffered a single gunshot wound. Despite immediate life-saving efforts by emergency responders, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Parmeley directed officers to her 2-year-old son. Isaac was located at Timber Creek Resort, a Holiday Inn property approximately 13 miles southwest of Festus in Jefferson County. A deputy found the toddler unresponsive in a decorative fountain in front of the resort. The deputy entered the water, brought Isaac to shore, and attempted to administer emergency care. Isaac was pronounced deceased shortly afterward. As investigators began building the timeline, the full sequence of that morning emerged through court documents, surveillance footage, witness accounts, and Parmeley's own statements to police, which were given after she was read her Miranda rights. According to the probable cause statement filed with the court, Parmeley had driven into St. Francois County earlier that morning to a rural road off Highway E near Bonne Terre. It was there, court documents allege, that she first attempted to harm 2-year-old Isaac. A witness in the area reported hearing a gunshot. Surveillance footage from a nearby camera captured Parmeley's vehicle in that vicinity. Court documents allege she initially tried to end Isaac's life there, referencing it in terms suggesting she believed she was protecting him, but Isaac was alive when she drove away. She then shot Scarlett in St. Francois County, placed her daughter's body in the trunk of the vehicle, and drove north into Jefferson County with both children in the car. When she realized Isaac was still breathing, she stopped at Timber Creek Resort and drowned him in the fountain. She then drove to the Festus Police Department and confessed. The word that emerged repeatedly in court documents, in statements from law enforcement, and in Parmeley's own account was sacrifice. Investigators said she had attempted to sacrifice her son. Her defense team later explained that, consistent with what 2 independent psychiatric evaluations found, Parmeley had been experiencing active delusions and hallucinations in the hours surrounding these events, and that in her severely altered mental state, she genuinely believed she was acting to protect and save her children from a perceived threat that existed only within her illness. Ashley Parmeley was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed criminal action. The charges carried the potential of life imprisonment or the death penalty upon conviction. She pleaded not guilty. The case moved through the courts over the following year. In May of 2025, her attorney announced his intention to pursue a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. An independent forensic evaluation, conducted at the request of her defense, concluded that Parmeley was unable to comprehend the wrongfulness of her actions at the time of the incident. A second evaluation, conducted by the Missouri Department of Mental Health, reached the same conclusion. On August 13, 2025, Jefferson County Circuit Judge Joseph Rathert accepted Ashley Parmeley's plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. She was found not guilty on all charges and committed to the Missouri Department of Mental Health for treatment. Jefferson County Prosecuting Attorney Tricia Stefanski acknowledged the outcome and said the plea was the only right and just result given the totality of the circumstances. Scarlett's father, Jason Doherty, had filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit in November of 2024. On December 30th of that year, a judge awarded him $3 million in a default judgment. The community of Festus did not stop grieving. Scarlett's teacher wrote on social media that her student had a gift for gathering people who needed a friend and making them feel included, that she had won a classroom award for that very quality. She had been looking forward to the 4th grade. Isaac had been learning to count. He had been a toddler who, by all accounts, thought the world of his big sister. They were two children whose lives ended on a spring morning before most of their neighborhood had finished their morning coffee. Mental health crises are real, they are devastating, and they do not always look the way we expect. The Compass Health Behavioral Health Crisis Center in Festus, referenced by Parmeley's defense team, now operates as a 24-hour walk-in facility for anyone experiencing a mental health emergency. The National Mental Health Crisis Line, 988, connects callers immediately with trained counselors, with or without law enforcement involvement. If you see someone struggling, please reach out. These resources exist because tragedies like this one have made clear that the gap between a crisis and catastrophe can sometimes be closed with a single phone call. Scarlett Parmeley was 9 years old. She wanted to pitch for the Pink Flamingos. She gave hugs freely and meant every one of them. She deserved a future. If this case moved you in any way, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support means everything to this channel and helps us bring stories like Scarlett's and Isaac's to audiences who will remember them. Subscribe, hit the bell. Case 3, Maya Caston. 2022 through 2023 conviction. St. Louis City Circuit Court, Missouri. Not every case that qualifies as a failure of care begins with violence. Some of the most sobering cases in the Missouri court record are the ones that arrive quietly. The ones built not on a single dramatic act, but on an accumulation of absence. An absence of attention. An absence of response. An absence of the most fundamental protective instinct a parent carries toward a newborn child. The case of Maya Caston falls into that category, and it sits differently than the others in this documentary precisely because of that distinction. It asks a harder, more uncomfortable question, not just what happened, but how. How does a parent arrive at that place? Maya Caston was a St. Louis, Missouri woman whose case came before the St. Louis City Circuit Court following the deaths of her newborn twins. According to reporting by KY3 and court records connected to the case, Caston failed to provide adequate care to her newborn twins in the period following their birth, and both infants did not survive as a result of that failure. The case was investigated and prosecuted as a matter of criminal neglect, not as a crime of intent in the traditional sense, but as a failure of duty that the legal system determined crossed the threshold into criminal responsibility. Maya Caston was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in connection with the deaths of her twins. The distinction between involuntary manslaughter and more severe homicide charges is significant and worth understanding in the context of a case like this one. Involuntary manslaughter in Missouri does not require prosecutors to prove that a person intended to cause harm. It requires proof that the person acted recklessly, that they consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk, and that their conduct represented a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise in the same situation. In the case of a newborn infant, a dependent who cannot signal distress effectively, cannot self-feed, cannot self-regulate temperature, and cannot survive without the direct physical intervention of a caregiver. The standard of care required is absolute. The court found that Maya Caston had failed to meet that standard. The result was the deaths of 2 infants who had no ability to protect themselves and no advocate other than the woman who had brought them into the world. Cases involving newborn neglect are among the most difficult in the child protection system to prosecute, because the line between a parent who was overwhelmed, undertreated, and unsupported, and a parent whose neglect crossed into criminal territory is not always easily drawn. Missouri courts have consistently held, however, that where an infant's death results from a sustained and identifiable failure to provide care, feeding, shelter, warmth, medical attention, the law's response must reflect the gravity of that outcome. For Maya Caston, that response was a criminal conviction. The case highlighted, as many like it do, the critical importance of postpartum support systems, home visiting programs, and community-based resources for new parents, especially in cases involving multiples, where the demands of caregiving are compounded from the very first moment. Organizations like Parents as Teachers, which operates extensively across Missouri, and the Missouri Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Network, exist precisely to bridge the gap between families in need and the care that can prevent tragedies from occurring. When those bridges are not reached in time, the consequences can be irreversible. 2 newborn children lost their lives. Their mother was convicted in a Missouri court and held accountable under the law. Their story is part of the larger Missouri record, a record that this documentary is committed to presenting with honesty, with respect for the victims, and with the understanding that accountability and awareness are not opposites. They are partners. The justice system responded. The court held Maya Caston accountable. And the 2 infants at the center of this case deserve to be remembered not as a footnote, but as 2 lives that mattered. 2 lives that should have had every chance at the world. If you believe a child in your community may be in need of support, the Missouri Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline can be reached at 1-800-392-3738. A call takes 60 seconds. It can change everything. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We cover these cases because the children involved deserve a witness, and every subscriber to this channel becomes part of that community of witnesses. Like, comment, and subscribe, and we will continue bringing you the stories that matter. Case 4, Corrinne O'Connor. November 27, 2023, Incident. March 16, 2026, Guilty Plea and Sentencing. Jackson County Circuit Court, Kansas City, Missouri. There are cases where a child's death might have been prevented at multiple points along the way. Cases where the warning signs existed, were documented, were reported, were reviewed, and still somehow did not result in the intervention that might have saved a life. The case of 5-year-old Grayson O'Connor is one of those cases. It is a case that prompted a Missouri state lawmaker to immediately call a formal meeting with the Department of Social Services. It is a case that led to an investigative review of why a child welfare file containing years of documented concerns had not translated into action before the morning of November 27, 2023. Grayson O'Connor was 5 years old. He loved dinosaurs. He loved fire trucks. He loved counting. He painted pictures with window markers and ran the halls of the Grand Boulevard lofts in downtown Kansas City with the kind of energy that neighbors noticed, smiled at, and remembered. He had $1 million smile, one neighbor later told reporters. He was going to grow up to be something. He never got the chance. On the morning of November 27, 2023, Thanksgiving week, Kansas City Police Department officers received a call to respond to the Grand Boulevard lofts, a high-rise apartment building located near East 10th Street and Grand Boulevard in downtown Kansas City. The call was described as a medical nature unknown. When officers arrived, they did not find a medical emergency in the conventional sense. They found Grayson O'Connor's body in the alley behind the building. He had suffered catastrophic injuries consistent with a fall from an extreme height. Officers looked up at the building's facade. They identified a single open window, fully open, on the 17th floor. They went up. Inside the apartment, they found Grayson's mother, Corrinne O'Connor, then 27 years old, near the open window. When officers asked about the whereabouts of her son, O'Connor told them he had gone out the window. She had not called 911. Investigators documented the conditions inside the apartment. Court records described the unit as deeply unsanitary, With no bedding on the mattresses, feces embedded in the carpet, and virtually no living amenities for a young child. An eviction petition that had been filed against O'Connor by the building's management alleged that she had removed the window safety stops, devices designed specifically to prevent windows from opening more than a few inches, from the apartment window prior to Grayson's death. Court documents filed in connection with the subsequent criminal case state that O'Connor knowingly created a substantial risk to her son's life by opening the window fully and failing to supervise Grayson in proximity to it. What emerged in the months that followed was a history that the Kansas City community found deeply disturbing. KSHB's investigative team obtained records showing that the Missouri Department of Social Services had received a total of 7 separate calls related to Grayson's welfare between 2017 and 2023. Those calls documented a range of concerns. Reports of O'Connor allegedly screaming at Grayson, accounts of the child being found wandering alone in the street at night, documentation of housing instability and prior drug concerns, observations of insufficient food in the home, and accounts of O'Connor appearing overwhelmed and unable to care for her son. In one particularly striking incident documented in those records, Grayson had been found wandering downtown alone after dark and was placed temporarily in a neighbor's care for several days. He was returned to his mother 4 days later. The final call to the state hotline came on the same day Grayson fell from the window. Kansas City Police Department had 8 total calls for service related to the Grand Boulevard Lofts apartment over the years, none of which had resulted in criminal referral to prosecutors. Missouri lawmakers responded to the case by calling for an immediate review of how the Department of Social Services had handled the O'Connor file, and specifically why a case with that volume of documented history had remained open and unresolved without intervention. Corrinne O'Connor was taken into custody in January of 2024 and charged with first-degree endangering the welfare of a child, a Class A felony carrying a potential sentence of 10 to 30 years in prison or life imprisonment. She was indicted by a grand jury on March 2, 2024. Her attorney initially stated an intention to pursue an insanity defense. O'Connor pleaded not guilty. The case proceeded through the courts over the course of more than 2 years. On March 16, 2026, Corrinne O'Connor appeared before Jackson County Circuit Court and entered a guilty plea to the amended charge of first-degree involuntary manslaughter, a Class C felony. The charge was amended to reflect that prosecutors needed to prove recklessness rather than knowing conduct, and O'Connor's guilty plea resolved the case without trial. She received the maximum sentence available under the charge, 10 years in the Missouri Department of Corrections, with credit for time already served in the Jackson County Jail. Jackson County Prosecutor Melissa Johnson issued a statement acknowledging that the plea had been reached after careful consideration of the evidence and circumstances. She said it allowed for accountability while also recognizing that a mother was now living with the consequences of what had occurred. Neighbors who gathered outside the building after the guilty plea was announced spoke about Grayson with the kind of warmth that made his absence feel even more acute. One neighbor, who had lived in the building for years and seen the little boy regularly, stood outside with tears in her eyes and said simply, "We love him, and we are sorry." His neighbor Daryl Young told reporters that Grayson had a smile that could touch your heart from across a room, and that he believed Grayson would have grown up to be something remarkable. Grayson O'Connor was 5 years old when he fell 17 stories in downtown Kansas City. He was found by a stranger passing through the building's basement exit. He deserved a window that stayed closed. He deserved a system that caught him before that morning. He deserved to grow up. The state of Missouri has since faced scrutiny over its child welfare protocols and its procedures for managing families with repeated documented concerns. Accountability for what happened to Grayson is not limited to one courtroom. It extends to every layer of the system that touched his file and moved on. Corrinne O'Connor will serve her sentence. The question of how Grayson's story might have ended differently remains one that Missouri's child protection community is still answering. If you are a neighbor, a teacher, a community member, or anyone who has concerns about a child's well-being, please contact the Missouri Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline at 1-800-392-3738. Your call is confidential. It can be the call that makes the difference. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Grayson's neighbors remembered him. Be part of the community that makes sure cases like his are never forgotten. Like, comment, subscribe, and share this with someone who cares. Case 5. Amberly Britton. August through December 2025. Investigation and arrest. St. Charles County Circuit Court, O'Fallon, Missouri. Law enforcement officers who spend careers in child protective investigations develop a certain capacity to compartmentalize, a professional distance that allows them to do the work without being destroyed by it. Detective Sergeant Brian Adelsberger of the St. Charles County Police Department has that capacity. He has investigated serious cases of child endangerment throughout his career. He has seen things that do not leave easily. And yet, when he stood before reporters in December of 2025 and was asked to describe the case of Amberly Britton and her 3 children, he did not reach for distance. He said, plainly, that this was one of the worst cases his entire team had ever investigated. Not just he personally, the entire team. That is a statement worth sitting with before the facts are even introduced. Amberly Britton was a resident of O'Fallon, Missouri, in St. Charles County, a suburban community west of St. Louis. She lived in a home with her partner, Mark Myers, and 3 children, a 13-year-old girl and 2 boys aged 7 and 8. The investigation that would eventually bring Britton and Myers to the attention of law enforcement began not with a tip, not with a neighbor's call, but with a 13-year-old child walking into school with a significant and visible laceration that required medical attention. School officials contacted the parents. There was no response. That silence was the opening through which everything else eventually came. When Britton and Myers failed to engage with school communications, investigators from the Missouri Department of Social Services were brought in to visit the home alongside law enforcement. What those investigators encountered when they entered the residence in O'Fallon would be described in court documents and police statements as conditions so dangerous and so deliberately constructed to cause suffering that St. Charles County Code Enforcement ultimately declared the home uninhabitable. The kitchen cabinets were secured with locks. The refrigerator was secured with a lock. When investigators asked about this, Britton and Myers told them the locks were necessary to control what the children ate. The children, according to court documents, had been so hungry on a regular basis that they had broken the locks themselves in order to access food. The 13-year-old girl told investigators that she had experienced severe hunger pains so significant that they caused her to vomit, and that when she vomited, she was punished for it. The bedroom doors were fitted with padlocks, devices that could be engaged from the outside, locking the children in. The bedroom windows had been screwed shut. The children described being locked in their rooms regularly, sometimes for the entire night. There were no children's toys found anywhere in the home. There was no bedding on any of the mattresses. The home had no functioning heat. Investigators documented a pervasive smell of urine throughout. The overall condition was described as extreme clutter combined with hazardous sanitation conditions. 2 of the 3 children spoke to investigators and described a pattern of physical discipline involving belts, paddles, and other objects. They described being grabbed and dragged. They described being told not to talk about anything that happened inside the home. During multiple visits by authorities over the course of the investigation, which had actually begun in August of 2025, months before the December arrests, investigators noted that on each occasion, Britton and Myers appeared evasive, impaired, or unresponsive. Both adults repeatedly claimed they were unable to complete drug testing when investigators received information suggesting methamphetamine was being used inside the residence. They were given opportunities to clean the home and address the safety hazards. According to court documents, no meaningful improvements were made. When authorities executed a search of the property in December of 2025, they discovered a large quantity of methamphetamine inside the home. Britton and Myers were both taken into custody. The St. Charles County Prosecuting Attorney's Office charged both with second-degree drug trafficking and 3 counts each of first-degree endangering the welfare of a child. Each was held on a $250,000 cash-only bond. Court records revealed that Amberly Britton was not a first-time offender in the area of child welfare. She had 5 prior convictions on counts of endangering the welfare of a child. 5. She had a prior conviction, and she had been in a relationship with a man, Mark Myers, who was listed on the sex offender registry following convictions for statutory rape and failure to register as a sex offender. Despite all of this, the children had remained in the home. Investigators noted that Britton had recently received money through an inheritance. There was no indication in the court record that any portion of those funds had been directed toward the children's benefit, toward food, bedding, clothing, warmth, or any of the basic necessities they had been denied. Both Britton and Myers, when confronted by investigators, blamed the children. They said the children lied. They expressed no remorse. Detective Sergeant Adelsberger, reflecting on the psychological dimensions of what those children had endured, the deliberate withholding of food, the locked doors, the locked cabinets, the darkness of a room they could not leave, said it was not just the physical neglect that made this case stand out. It was the psychological intent embedded in the conditions. The level and extent of the neglect, he said, combined with the psychological factors that had been deliberately imposed on those children, put this case in a category of its own. The 3 children were removed from the home and placed in protective custody. They were safe. After months of living in conditions that no child should ever have to endure, they were safe. As of February 2026, Britton was scheduled for a disposition hearing that could move the case toward a plea agreement or a trial date. The investigation was continuing. There is a network of resources in Missouri and across the country dedicated specifically to identifying, reporting, and responding to child endangerment before it reaches the level documented in this case. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, reachable at 1-800-422-4453, operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with trained crisis counselors available in 170 languages. If you suspect a child is living in unsafe conditions, that number is a place to start. 3 children in O'Fallon, Missouri, are alive today because a 13-year-old girl went to school with a cut on her body and a teacher noticed. Accountability is moving forward in the courts. These children's stories matter. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These cases exist in public court records because communities demanded transparency and accountability. Be part of that community. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who cares about protecting children. Case 6, Krista Roy. September 26th through 29th, 2025. St. Charles County Circuit Court, St. Charles, Missouri. Carter Bennett was 16 years old, and by every account offered by the people who knew him, he was exactly the kind of young man who makes a community better simply by being part of it. His coach at St. Charles Mixed Martial Arts described watching him transform over the years from a shy, quiet kid into someone confident and outgoing who lit up every room he entered. His neighbor Natalie, with tears in her eyes, told reporters she would do anything to change what happened. She said he did not deserve it. Not at all. The friends who had spent time with him over that last weekend, who had dropped him off at his home on Lightfoot Drive around 2 in the morning on a Saturday, said that when they could not reach him the following day, they knew something was wrong. They said it was highly unusual. They said Carter always responded. That instinct, that something was deeply wrong, led those friends to contact the St. Charles Police Department on Monday, September 29th, 2025, and ask officers to perform a welfare check at the home of Carter Bennett's mother. When officers arrived, they encountered a foul odor coming from the residence. They entered. They found Carter in his bed. He had been there for days. He was 16 years old, and he was gone. Carter's mother, Krista Roy, 47 years old, was not at the home. She had been taken to a local hospital earlier that same Monday after apparently attempting to take her own life. Investigators went to the hospital. They waited for her to be released from treatment. When she was, they took her into custody for questioning. What followed in that police interview, as documented in the probable cause affidavit filed with the St. Charles County Circuit Court and reviewed by Law and Crime and multiple regional outlets, was a confession of extraordinary detail. Krista Roy did not deny what she had done. She explained it. She told detectives that on Friday, September 26, 2025, she had gone to her ex-husband's residence and taken his Bursa .380 caliber pistol. She had done so, she said, with the intention of shooting her son and then turning the gun on herself. She brought the firearm back to the home on Lightfoot Drive. She waited. At some point while Carter was sleeping, Krista Roy entered his room and shot him multiple times in his bed. According to the probable cause affidavit, after the shooting, Carter was still alive. Roy did not call for help. She did not attempt to get him medical assistance. Instead, court documents state, She lay down in the bed next to her son. She held him. Carter called out to her. He called her name. He said, "Mommy." He said it multiple times. Roy then got up, went to the kitchen, and retrieved a knife. She returned to Carter's room and inflicted additional injuries, she told investigators, to put him out of his pain. When detectives asked her directly whether she had wanted to end her son's life, her answer was yes. The St. Charles County Prosecuting Attorney's Office charged Krista Roy with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed criminal action. She was transported to the St. Charles County Jail and held on a $1 million cash-only bond. Prosecuting Attorney Joseph McCulloch addressed the community at a press conference and laid out the basic facts of the case, including Roy's account of lying next to her son as he called for her. Carter's friends gathered. His coach at the gym gathered. Neighbors who had watched him grow up gathered. A candlelight vigil was organized for the Saturday after his body was discovered outside the home of his neighbor Natalie Black on Lancaster Drive in St. Charles. People stood together in the dark with candles and said his name. They shared what they remembered about him. They cried. A judge ordered an independent clinical psychological evaluation of Krista Roy in October of 2025. That evaluation was ongoing as of the available reporting. The defense has not yet formally entered a plea or announced a legal strategy beyond the initial not guilty arraignment procedure. The case raises profoundly difficult questions. Questions about what leads a parent to that place, about the warning signs that may or may not have existed before September 26th, about the intersection of mental health crisis and criminal responsibility, and about the young life that was extinguished in the process of whatever was happening inside that home on Lightfoot Drive. Those questions will be answered, in part, in a St. Charles County courtroom. What is not a question is who Carter Bennett was. He was a young man who had found himself, who had walked into a boxing gym as a shy teenager and walked out, over time, as someone his coach described with unmistakable pride. He was someone whose friends noticed when he went quiet. He was someone whose neighbors lit candles for in the dark. He was 16. He deserved the life that was ahead of him. The justice system in St. Charles County is moving forward. Krista Roy will face the full weight of a first-degree murder charge. Carter's story will be told in court, on the record, with the seriousness it demands. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis or thoughts of harming themselves or others, please reach out immediately to the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988. Help is available around the clock. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Carter Bennett's friends made the call that brought this case to light. Your subscription is another way of saying that these lives matter and these stories deserve to be told. Like, comment, and subscribe, and we will be back with Case 7. Case 7, Brenda Deutsch. April 2025, arrest and initial charges. Lincoln County Circuit Court, Winfield, Missouri. Winfield, Missouri is a town of approximately 1,500 people, situated about 45 miles northwest of downtown St. Louis in Lincoln County. It is the kind of small community where residents tend to know their neighbors, where the schools are relatively small, and where a family that has lived in the area for a long time becomes part of the fabric of local life. Brenda Deutsch had been part of that fabric for a very long time. She was 70 years old when she was arrested in April of 2025. She had been a licensed foster and adoptive parent in the state of Missouri for decades. By the time investigators began formally documenting what had allegedly occurred inside her home, they determined she had provided care to over 200 children across a span of more than 2 decades. That number, 200 children, is significant. It speaks to a level of engagement with the foster care system that would, under normal circumstances, suggest a person of substantial commitment to vulnerable youth. The system that approved, licensed, monitored, and renewed her placement status across those 2 decades trusted her with the lives of Missouri's most vulnerable young people. Children who had already experienced instability, trauma, and loss before they ever arrived at her door. What Lincoln County Prosecuting Attorney Mike Wood described when the case became public in April of 2025 was something entirely different. The case broke open not because of a tip to a hotline, though tips had been made, many of them, over many years, but because of a school. In February of 2025, the Winfield School District reported to authorities that one of Deutsch's foster children had been persistently absent from school and could not be located. A deputy serving as a school resource officer began investigating. In the course of that investigation, a rumor surfaced. A rumor so unusual that investigators might have dismissed it outright were it not for the fact that multiple witnesses came forward to corroborate it independently. The rumor was that Brenda Deutsch had sent the missing foster child to Texas, and that the purpose of sending her there was to exchange her for an exotic animal, specifically, a monkey. Prosecuting attorney Wood, speaking to reporters, was careful to frame it precisely as it stood at that stage of the investigation. There was, he said, smoke. And there were at least 2 witnesses coming forward saying that was the case. As strange as it sounded, he said, his office had handled human trafficking cases before, and they were treating the allegation seriously. The foster child was located in Texas. She was found living in conditions described as deplorable, in a home so cold the pipes had burst, with inadequate adult supervision, essentially left to look after residents of the home, while the person responsible for her was gone for extended periods. Texas Child Protective Services intervened and removed the child from the premises. She was placed in a group home. According to prosecuting attorney Wood, she was, at the time of the court proceedings, thriving. But the Texas discovery was only the surface layer of what investigators began to uncover. According to the probable cause statement filed in Lincoln County, the Missouri Department of Social Services had received an anonymous report in November of 2024 alleging that Deutsch was abusing the victim. In December of that year, investigators interviewed the child. She described a pattern of abuse that had reportedly begun approximately 3 years prior to the investigation. She described being struck with a paddle, with wooden trim, with a shoe, and with an open hand. She said that on at least one occasion, another person in the household had held her down while Deutsch struck her. She said Deutsch would take her clothing away as a form of punishment. When investigators reached out to former foster children and members of the broader community, what they found was deeply alarming. Deutsch's biological daughter, Brenda, told reporters that allegations of abuse had been present for as long as she could remember, that she had personally called the child abuse hotline multiple times over the years to report her mother's conduct. She described calling repeatedly and being told, the majority of the time, that investigators would not even enter the home. Lincoln County prosecuting attorney Wood said that when he reviewed the law enforcement database for the Deutsch residence, he found no prior police reports, no prior requests for criminal prosecution, and no prior referrals. The volume of alleged abuse that had apparently occurred over a decade or more had not, to that point, generated a single entry in the criminal record. He described it as a well-known residence, one that had cycled through what he characterized as a culture of abuse and neglect, and said he was disturbed and at a loss to explain how it had remained entirely outside the criminal system for so long. A second child who had been living in Deutsch's home at the time of her arrest was removed and placed in protective custody. Another note in the court record, offered by the prosecuting attorney himself, expressed genuine bewilderment about why, if one child in the home had already been placed in protective custody in Texas, the second child had not been removed simultaneously. Brenda Deutsch was charged with 2 counts of abuse or neglect of a child and 1 count of endangering the welfare of a child. Her cash-only bond was set at $250,000. She was subsequently indicted by a grand jury in May of 2025 on all counts. In July of 2025, she posted bond and was released under conditions that included surrendering her passport and having no contact with witnesses or victims. In August of 2025, prosecutors filed additional charges, 3 counts of forgery and 1 count of theft, alleging that Deutsch had submitted invoices and received reimbursement payments from the state for foster care services that were never actually provided. The investigation was described by the prosecuting attorney as lengthy and ongoing, with the expectation that it would cover more than a decade of documented allegations involving a large number of potential victims. Over 200 children passed through Brenda Deutsch's home. More than 200 calls were made to the child abuse hotline about that home. The first criminal charges were filed in April of 2025. That gap, between 200 calls and 0 prior prosecutions, is the part of this case that Missouri's child welfare community is still reckoning with. Prosecuting attorney Wood said his office would be looking not only at the criminal charges against Deutsch herself, but at the systemic failures that allowed the situation to persist for as long as it did. If you have information about potential abuse that occurred in the Lincoln County area involving foster or adopted children who may have been in Brenda Deutsch's care, the Lincoln County Prosecuting Attorney's Office can be reached at 636-462-4238. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office can be reached at 636-462-6513. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. The children who passed through that home in Winfield deserve protection. They deserved someone paying attention. Your subscription and your engagement help us continue documenting cases where the system fell short and demanding that the records show what happened. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these children's stories matter. Case 8, Bianca Wells. October 27, 2025, Incident. November 19, 2025, Charges filed. St. Louis City Circuit Court, St. Louis, Missouri. There is a particular weight that comes with cases where a child's death was not the direct act of the parent who is ultimately charged, but where the parent's choices place that child in the path of harm, and where the legal system must grapple with the question of responsibility at one remove. These cases are among the most difficult in the child protection legal framework, because they require courts and communities to examine not just what happened, but what was known, and when it was known, and what was chosen in full awareness of that knowledge. The case of 2-year-old Bianca Wells falls into that category, and it is a case that St. Louis courts and prosecutors have taken seriously as a matter of criminal accountability. Bianca Wells was 2 years old. He lived in the St. Louis area with his mother, 21-year-old Bianca Wells. At some point during October of 2025, Bianca Wells began leaving Bianca in the care of a man named Nico Cotton, who was also 21 years old. The investigation that followed Bianca's death established, according to court documents filed by St. Louis prosecutors, that Bianca Wells knew, based on Cotton's prior conduct, that leaving her son in his care would place the child at substantial risk. On the evening of October 27, 2025, officers with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department received 2 calls in rapid succession from the same area of the city. The first came from the 4900 block of Thekla. The second came from the vicinity of Interstate 70 and St. Louis Avenue, reporting an unresponsive 2-year-old child. Officers responded and located Bianca. He was transported to the hospital. He did not survive. Bianca Wells was pronounced deceased that evening. In the days that followed, the St. Louis medical examiner conducted an autopsy. The ruling was homicide. The examination documented evidence of strangulation. It documented injuries consistent with severe physical harm, and it documented injuries consistent with sexual assault. Nico Cotton turned himself into police on October 29, 2025. The St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office charged him with second-degree murder, first-degree forcible sodomy, statutory sodomy of a person less than 12 years old, and abuse of a child resulting in death. The probable cause documents allege that Cotton had been the child's sole caregiver for multiple days during which the abuse occurred, and that during police questioning he admitted to being in that caregiving role. The investigation concluded that Cotton had subjected Bianca to extreme and sustained harm during the period he was in his care. On November 19, 2025, prosecutors turned to the question of maternal accountability. Bianca Wells was charged with endangering the welfare of a child resulting in death. The probable cause statement filed by St. Louis police stated that throughout October, but specifically on or about October 27th, Wells had left Bianca in the care of Nico Cotton with the knowledge that Cotton's prior conduct made him a substantial risk to her son's safety. The legal argument was straightforward and significant. She knew. She left her child with him anyway, and her child did not come home. Wells was released from jail on sponsored recognizance, meaning a responsible party agreed to ensure her court appearances while the case proceeds. The case of Bianca Wells joins a sadly large body of child fatality cases in Missouri and across the country in which the question of parental responsibility is not answered by the parents' own direct actions, but by the decisions they made about who they entrusted with their most vulnerable and dependent person in their care. The law, in Missouri, does not require direct action to establish criminal culpability when a parent's knowing choices result in a child's death. The charge of endangering the welfare of a child resulting in death is precisely designed for this circumstance. Bianca Wells was 2 years old. He had his entire life ahead of him. He was entirely dependent on the adults in his world to keep him safe. The court record will determine how full accountability is allocated in this case. What is not in dispute is that Brien deserved protection he did not receive. If you have information about a child who you believe is being placed in unsafe circumstances, please contact the Missouri Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline at 1-800-392-3738. Reports are taken seriously and can be made anonymously. A child's life may depend on the call you make today. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Brien Wells was 2 years old. His name should be known. Your subscription helps us ensure that the names of children like Brien are remembered and that their cases are brought to audiences who will hold the system accountable. Like, comment, and subscribe, and we will be right back with Case 9. Case 9, Alyssa Wehmeyer. February 28, 2025, child's death. March 4, 2025, arrest and charges. Scott County Jail, Cape Girardeau County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. There are moments in criminal case documentation where a single detail, one line buried in a probable cause statement, carries more weight than pages of surrounding text. In the case of Alyssa Wehmeyer, that detail is a timeline of hours. Hours during which a 1-year-old child cried, went silent, and was not responded to. Hours during which an infant who could not feed herself, could not call for help, could not understand why no one was coming, waited in a crib for care that did not arrive. The case of Alyssa Wehmeyer is a case built on hours. And what those hours add up to, according to Missouri state prosecutors, is a crime. Wehmeyer was 21 years old and lived in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, a city of approximately 40,000 people in the southeastern part of the state. She was employed as a jailer at the Cape Girardeau Police Department at the time of her arrest, a detail that added a layer of painful contrast to the facts of the case when it became public. She was a young woman with a law enforcement job and a 1-year-old child in her care at home. On February 26, 2025, at some point in the late afternoon, investigators established a time between 5 and 6 in the evening. Wehmeyer fed her 1-year-old child. That, according to her own account to investigators, was the last time the infant ate. After feeding the baby that evening, Wehmeyer changed the child's diaper and placed the infant to sleep in a crib. The following evening, February 27th, Wehmeyer again changed the child's diaper at approximately 6:30 in the evening and placed the infant back to sleep in the crib. At that point, the child had not been fed in approximately 24 hours. In the early hours of February 28, 2025, at some point around 2 in the morning, the infant woke up and began to cry. Wehmeyer got up. According to her account to investigators, she held the child for approximately 30 to 40 minutes. She then placed the baby back in the crib and returned to sleep without feeding the infant. The child had now gone approximately 33 hours without food. Wehmeyer told investigators she did not check on the baby again until approximately 1 in the afternoon on February 28th, approximately 11 hours after that 2 in the morning interaction. When she entered the room, she found her child unresponsive. The infant's lips were blue. The child was not breathing. Emergency responders were called. The 1-year-old child was pronounced deceased on February 28, 2025. The Cape Girardeau Police Department contacted the Missouri State Highway Patrol's Division of Drug and Crime Control to assist in the investigation of what they described as a suspicious death. The Troop E Criminal Investigations Unit conducted the investigation. Investigators met with Wehmeyer and documented her account of the timeline. They requested an autopsy. The autopsy results were unambiguous. The cause of death was dehydration. The forensic examination found very little evidence of food in the child's stomach. The medical conclusion was consistent with severe malnutrition and neglect over a sustained period. When Wehmeyer was asked by investigators about why she had not fed the infant during that extended period, she told them she had a migraine. On March 4, 2025, Alyssa Wehmeyer was arrested and charged with 1 felony count of abuse or neglect of a child resulting in death. She was transported to the Scott County Jail and held on a $100,000 cash-only bond. The Cape Girardeau County Prosecuting Attorney's Office formally charged her on the same day following review of the Missouri State Highway Patrol's investigative findings. At her first court appearance on March 6, 2025, Wehmeyer waived the reading of the charges and requested a public defender. A bond hearing was subsequently scheduled. Investigators noted in the record that Wehmeyer was employed in a law enforcement setting at the time of the offense, a fact that prosecutors and the court would need to weigh within the broader context of the case. The case of Alyssa Wehmeyer sits at the intersection of criminal neglect and the question of awareness. She was not, according to the available record, unaware of her child. She interacted with the baby during the period in question. She was present in the home. She woke when the infant cried. The prosecution's argument is that her response to every signal her child sent, hunger, distress, the simple biological need of an infant who cannot feed itself, was insufficient, sustained, and criminal in its consequence. A 1-year-old child in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, died of dehydration. The cause was the absence of care from the one person in the world who was responsible for providing it. The case is proceeding through the Missouri court system. Accountability is moving forward. If you are a young parent or someone supporting a new parent who may be struggling, please know that help is available. Parents as Teachers Missouri provides free home visiting services to families with young children and can be reached through their statewide network. The Missouri Family Support Division can connect struggling families with resources for food, healthcare, and emergency support. No parent should ever feel that the only option is silence. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. This channel exists because every child's life matters and every case deserves a witness. We are almost at Case 10, and Case 10 is one of the most internationally reported Missouri cases in recent memory. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Like, comment, and stay with us. Case 10, Mariah Thomas. February 9, 2024. Jackson County Circuit Court, Kansas City, Missouri. There are cases that cross the boundaries of local news and land in the international media. Cases that get translated into headlines in languages other than English, that are discussed in newsrooms and on broadcast networks far beyond the city or state where they originated. These are usually cases where the facts are so unusual, so far outside the frame of what a reasonable person can anticipate or explain, that the story travels on the sheer force of the question it poses. How is this possible? The case of Mariah Thomas and the death of her 1-month-old daughter Zariah Thomas became one of those cases in February of 2024. It originated in Kansas City, Missouri, in the Midtown neighborhood near East 41st Street and Forest Avenue. It was investigated by the Kansas City Police Department, prosecuted by Jackson County Prosecutor Gene Peters Baker, and covered by every major national and international outlet within days of the initial charges being filed. What made it travel was the claim at its center, a claim so disorienting that initial readers and viewers often had to read the sentence twice to confirm they had understood it correctly. Mariah Thomas told police she accidentally put her infant in the oven instead of the crib. Thomas was 25 years old at the time of the incident. She lived at the Forest Avenue residence with her parents, the infant's maternal grandparents, and her 1-month-old daughter Zariah, who had been born just weeks before February 9, 2024. Zariah was, by any measure, at the most fragile and dependent stage of human life, a newborn whose every need depended entirely on the adults in that home. On the afternoon of February 9, 2024, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, the Kansas City Police Department received a call for a non-breathing infant at the Forest Avenue residence. Officers and firefighters responded. When they arrived, they found Zariah Thomas with apparent burn wounds. She was unresponsive. Responders declared her deceased at the scene. The Kansas City Fire Department confirmed the death on scene. Detectives from KCPD began their investigation immediately. In the course of that investigation, detectives spoke to the infant's maternal grandfather, who told them he had received a phone call from Thomas at approximately 1 in the afternoon. Thomas told him something was wrong with the baby and that he needed to come home right away. When the grandfather returned to the house, he reported smelling smoke inside the residence. He found his granddaughter gone. When he confronted Thomas, she told him that she had thought she was putting the baby down in her crib, but had accidentally put her in the oven instead. The infant's maternal grandmother also received a phone call from Thomas around the same time. By the grandmother's account, Thomas was screaming hysterically on the phone. Thomas was taken into custody. She consented to allow detectives to access her phone data and to provide a blood draw for testing. The Jackson County Prosecutor's Office reviewed the case on Saturday, February 10, 2024, and issued charges against Mariah Thomas that same day. Jackson County Prosecutor Gene Peters Baker charged Thomas with a Class A felony, first-degree endangering the welfare of a child resulting in the death of a child. Prosecutor Baker issued a written statement acknowledging the deeply disturbing nature of the case and extending recognition to the first responders who had worked the scene. She said the office's hearts were weighted by the loss of this precious life, and that she trusted the criminal justice system to respond appropriately to the circumstances. The charge carried a sentencing range of 10 to 30 years in prison upon conviction. Thomas appeared before a Jackson County judge on February 13, 2024. The judge set her cash bond at $200,000, ordered her to take any prescribed medication and complete a mental health evaluation, and prohibited her from having contact with any witnesses in the case. On February 20th, her bond was reduced to $100,000. As of February 20th, jail records indicated she remained in custody. Mariah Thomas was arraigned and pleaded not guilty on March 4, 2024. A trial date was subsequently set for January 13, 2025. 1-month-old Zariah Thomas had been alive for just under 5 weeks. The case generated not only international media attention, but also significant public discourse about the intersection of mental health, postpartum conditions, and criminal responsibility. Mental health professionals and legal observers noted that the behavior described, placing an infant in an oven, was so far outside any rational framework that questions about the mother's mental state at the time of the incident were, at minimum, serious enough to warrant careful forensic evaluation. The court's order for a mental health evaluation in the early stages of the case reflected that recognition. Whether the explanation ultimately offered at trial, or in any subsequent proceedings, frames this as an act of profound mental illness, severe impairment, or criminal conduct of another kind, is a question that the Jackson County legal process is tasked with answering. What is not subject to interpretation is who Zariah Thomas was. She was 1 month old. She had a first name. She had grandparents who loved her enough to race home the moment they received a call telling them something was wrong. She had a short life that was full of the total dependence and trust that all newborns carry, the absolute belief that the world into which they have arrived is safe. Because what else would a newborn know? Zariah Thomas deserved to grow up. She deserved to know her name, to recognize the faces around her, to take her first steps, to speak her first words, to grow into whoever she was going to be. She was 1 month old, and she deserved every year that was taken from her. The Jackson County courts carry the responsibility of determining what accountability looks like in this case. The justice system is moving forward. The record will reflect what happened on East 41st Street on February 9, 2024. If you are a new parent experiencing distress, confusion, or thoughts that frighten you, please reach out immediately to a healthcare provider, a trusted adult, or call 988, the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, where trained counselors are available around the clock. Postpartum mental health crises are real, they are recognized medical conditions, and help is available. Please reach out before it is too late. This documentary has taken us through 10 cases, 10 Missouri mothers, 10 sets of victims, 10 separate moments where the justice system was called upon to respond to failures of care so significant that they left investigators, prosecutors, judges, and communities searching for adequate words. From the federal courtroom in Springfield where Amber Waterman was told she would spend the rest of her life in prison, to the Jackson County proceedings where a 1-month-old child named Zariah waits for the court to complete the accounting of her death. Each of these cases carries its own weight, its own set of questions, and its own reminder of why the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable among us matters so much, and cost so much when they fall short. The children named in this documentary, Ashley Bush, Valkyrie Grace Willis, Scarlett Parmeley, Isaac Baum, the twins of Maya Caston, Grayson O'Connor, the 3 children of O'Fallon, Carter Bennett, the foster children of Brenda Deutsch's home, Breon Wells, the infant in Cape Girardeau, and Zariah Thomas, deserve to be remembered by name, treated with dignity, and spoken about with the seriousness their lives demand. Cold Case Hour is committed to presenting these stories with accuracy, respect, and purpose. True crime documentary content, at its best, does not just tell you what happened. It asks you to care. It asks you to pay attention. It asks you to be the kind of neighbor, teacher, coach, or community member who notices and acts before the story reaches a courtroom. If you have concerns about a child's safety, please contact the Missouri Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline at 1-800-392-3738. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-422-4453. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available for anyone in mental health distress. These resources exist because communities built them. Use them. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this documentary moved you, informed you, or gave voice to a case you believe deserves to be heard, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you are notified the moment the next episode drops. Every like, every comment, every subscriber is a signal to this platform that responsible, dignified, serious true crime content has an audience, and that audience is you. We will see you in the next episode. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop asking what happened.